This is Taylor Elkins. Taylor's teacher, 72-year-old William Dubois, was discovered brutally beaten and deceased inside his home. What's interesting is that days later, Taylor would be found driving her now dead teacher's car. What seemed like a straightforward case would turn out to be a complicated mess of neighborhood drama, secret affairs, and deadly conflicts. On July 11, 2019, officers in Fort Smith, Arkansas received a call from a neighbor requesting a welfare check at the home of 72-year-old William Dubois Jr. The neighbor had grown increasingly worried when he heard an unusual noise coming from William's home a few days earlier and had seen no sign of him since. Officers were quickly dispatched to investigate further. This is Denton Stringer, the neighbor who called 911 to request a welfare check. He would soon prove to be more involved in this case than just being a neighbor. The officer believes William might just have left. That is, until she discovers a disturbing odor coming from inside the house.
1-9 station, can we have an operator meet me on 3, please?
Due to the unusual situation, Officer Hendricks calls for a backup officer, who arrived quickly and would be briefed on the discoveries. That odor could have been coming from the trash can, but Officer Hendricks was convinced it was coming from inside the house. The officers needed to get in. However, a strange odor alone was not enough to obtain a search warrant. So, Officer Hendricks decided to ask around the neighborhood, and she would soon discover that Denton Stringer had done some suspicious things since William's disappearance. Officer Hendricks didn't waste any time and decided to head to the store directly across from William's house to see if anyone had seen or heard anything. What the shop owner just revealed is very significant. Firstly, William, who is known around the neighborhood by Bill, hasn't been seen for the past 2 to 3 days, which is highly unusual according to the shop owner. Secondly, William's neighbor, Denton Stringer, is known to have frequent drama at his house involving various women. Recently, Denton had asked the shop owner to call William to check on him, explaining that his daughter had stolen his phone. If true, this daughter might be the same woman Denton argues with often, and if she took his phone, there is a possibility she could also be linked to William's car missing. Finally, the shop owner claims that if something bad happened to William, it would be them, suggesting that Denton and the daughter were likely involved. All of this casts suspicion on both Denton and his daughter. Officers hope that whatever they find inside William's house might reveal just how involved they were in his disappearance. With all of this in her head, Officer Hendricks returns to William's house, where officers had managed to contact the landlord for an additional key. Nothing could have prepared them for the horrifying scene they would discover inside.
Oh, that's good. Oh, that's everywhere.
Really?
There's some heaters in the lounge.
I wonder what it is.
And there's no TV in the living room.
As officers enter the house, they find William's lifeless body in the bathroom. It soon becomes clear that this was no natural passing. What the officers had discovered was nothing short of horrific, but the attacker had left a lot of clues, meaning police could piece together a story. For starters, the body had a strong, rotten smell, indicating that William had likely been dead for over 24 hours. Throughout the house, shelves and drawers had been left open, with numerous valuables missing. This initially led investigators to believe it was a robbery. However, this is where they discovered something very curious. The front door had been locked from the outside, and there were no signs of forced entry. Officers realized that a scenario like this couldn't be possible unless William's attacker somehow had a key to his house. In other words, whoever did this to William must have a closer connection to him than a random burglar. This made the shop owner's earlier comments even more interesting to police. They had mentioned that if anything happened to William, it would probably be Denton and his so-called daughter, both of whom were close enough to William to have been given a spare key. So with no better leads, Denton quickly became the main focus of the investigation, and police began to wonder if he was simply a concerned neighbor or if he knew far more about William's death than he was letting on. To find answers, the cops needed to locate that red Ford Focus, which was now on the radar of the entire Fort Smith Police Department. Whoever had possession of William's vehicle could undoubtedly help solve this case, but the officers had no idea where to start looking until William's son arrived at the scene, providing them with a major breakthrough. According to the Sun, William had a GPS tracking device installed in his car, and the car is actually owned by William's wife Susan, who has access to a mobile app that could track his location. The cops now know this tracking device is their only key to crack the case wide open and catch the killer. So with this in mind, officers would quickly redirect their attention to Susan's home, but unfortunately, they'd also have the difficult task of informing Susan that her husband passed away. Thanks to Susan, the cops now know where the missing vehicle is. Without wasting any time, officers quickly leave Susan's house and head towards the location of the car, but they have no idea who has it or what kind of danger they could be facing when they find it. After all, this is the stolen car of a murdered man. It seems there's someone in this house who wants to avoid the cops, and these officers know they could be walking into an ambush, so everybody behind that door is a person of interest. Officers would go on to conduct a room-by-room sweep of the house and confirm it was empty before returning outside to face a different challenge: a handful of detained suspects with potential ties to William's missing car. Among the small group, officers noted a mix of faces, some nervous, some indifferent, but it wasn't immediately clear who knew what until the question of the red car came up. The moment Officer Shelby asked who owned the red Ford parked out front, everyone pointed, without hesitation, at the same person: Taylor Elkins, the first woman who exited the house earlier when police barged inside. Having possession of a man's car who had just turned up dead is naturally going to raise suspicion, and surprisingly, Taylor herself would go on to admit that indeed, the car belongs to her. With this revelation, the focus was pinned directly on Taylor, and it was time for her to explain how she ended up in the possession of a dead man's car. Despite Taylor's vague recollection of how she came in possession of William's car, officers managed to get a name from her: Sean, who is a friend of Taylor that she borrowed the car from, or at least that's what she claims. If her story is not a complete fabrication, then whoever Sean is could be the key to solving this case. However, it's at this time that officers realized they didn't know nearly enough about Taylor, her background, her relationships, and whether she might be tied to Denton Stringer, the neighbor who was already under suspicion. So over the next few minutes, we will follow these officers in real time as they connect the dots and discover critical information in one of the best detective works we have ever covered. The officer just made a crucial connection. Taylor's last known address, given to police during her previous arrest, was her grandparents' house, and the same duplex that William lived in. The officers figured it out. The two prime suspects were related. Taylor was Denton's granddaughter, and likely the daughter the woman in the shop had found suspicious earlier. But what these officers are about to discover next would put the spotlight solely on Taylor. With this final piece of evidence, it is safe to conclude that Taylor Elkins has a major role in William's death, and detectives needed to get to the bottom of her involvement. The other detained individuals were briefly questioned, but no one had direct ties to William or knew anything about the stolen vehicle, so with no solid evidence against them, they were released. With the on-scene investigation at its end, the next move was obvious: taking Taylor in for a formal interrogation. A few hours later, Taylor is placed inside an interrogation room and left by herself for the next 10 minutes, giving her enough time to come up with a plausible alibi to go with. What Taylor doesn't realize is that when the detective walks in, he has information that will completely disprove every excuse she has. In just a few minutes, this detective was able to make Taylor confirm most of the evidence connecting her to the crime. In her own words, Taylor admitted that Denton Stringer is indeed her grandfather, she had William's car for a few days, and most importantly, she was at Denton's house the same period when William was killed. But this detective was just getting started, and he's about to make Taylor dig her own grave. Taylor is trapped. She just implicated herself further by admitting that she knows William, and, to her surprise, was driving his very car. After this brilliant line of questioning, the detective tells Taylor to sit tight and leaves the room. During this time, he would make a phone call to Taylor's grandfather, Denton Stringer, and Denton would tell him that Taylor was at his house a few days ago along with two white males. With this information at hand, the detective comes back to the interrogation room with one goal: make Taylor confess to whatever she did inside William's home. Even when directly confronted with undeniable facts, Taylor continues to play dumb, even making a mockery of the entire situation. So, in order to make it clear to Taylor that this is a serious situation, the detective would reveal the true reason she's in the interrogation room: because she is a murder suspect. Now that Taylor understands the severity of everything and is deeply emotional, the detective will seize the moment to confront her by exploiting her vulnerable state in hopes that the emotional pressure will break her defenses and compel her to finally tell the truth. Now it seems like Taylor has a story to prove her alibi. Taylor claims that William's car belongs to a man named Sean, who she borrowed the car from recently. If what she's saying is true, then Sean could very well be the perpetrator of this evil crime. However, Taylor would also proceed to point more accusations towards Sean, telling the detective that he assaulted her, ruined her life, and took her kids away. This means that Taylor was likely involved in a relationship with Sean for a good amount of time. But what's strange about this entire story is that every time the detective asks Taylor for personal information about this Sean guy, she dodges the questions and refuses to give any information away. So, with Taylor seemingly uncooperative, the detective would end this interview to get to the bottom of her claims and figure out who Sean really is. And what they discovered would put Taylor in an even worse situation. Sean giving her the car was a completely fabricated story, and the detective just proved it. So, with this major lie exposed, Taylor is taken away to sleep in jail while detectives work on finding more incriminating evidence against her. The next day, Taylor is brought back into the interrogation room in an orange jumpsuit. This time, the detective has prepared undeniable evidence to thoroughly debunk her entire alibi and make her confess. Elkin's body language has shifted from cocky and playful to scared and confused, and just about everything else in between. Her behavior would change again after she's allowed to make a phone call to her mother, where she'd stop pleading innocence and start playing the victim. She's now going to paint a picture of a man named Joseph Rogers, better known as Joe, that will make him out to be the bad guy. Elkins has implicated Joe by claiming he'd taken care of William while he was robbing him of his belongings. She also claims he's behind the whole thing and she was too terrified to stop him. If this wasn't the third story she'd came up with, the detectives may have believed her. But what Elkins doesn't realize is that the detectives have potential evidence that will place her at the scene of the crime and prove she's been lying all along. If that lock of hair they found on William's body belongs to Elkins, then her stories will mean nothing, as the physical evidence will do the talking for her. But right now, that's not the only thing she has to worry about, as detectives have even more evidence that proves her whole story has been a lie from the very beginning, and it's all thanks to the GPS tracker William's wife installed in his car. That GPS tracker would also help detectives to map everywhere she had been from the very moment she stepped in the car, and then use the CCTV to determine who was inside the vehicle. Taylor's arrogance with the entire situation has seemed to finally have caught up to her, and her extreme stubbornness has left the detectives with no choice other than to resort to other methods of incriminating suspects, such as DNA samples, hair samples, and last but not least, the polygraph. The polygraph test was done off camera. However, the polygraph examiner would have some harsh words for Taylor after the test had concluded. Taylor would never formally confess during the rest of the interrogation, continuing to point fingers, blame others, sometimes being completely imaginary people, and playing the victim. William Dubois Jr. had suffered from 27 impact injuries and met a terrifying end the day of his death. The hair sample found in William's hand was eventually matched to the hair of Taylor's, adding one final cherry on top to help convict her. Detectives ultimately believed Elkins was responsible. Although she didn't confess to the cops, she allegedly made a confession during her incarceration. She also told another inmate that she went to William's house to borrow some money and had become angry when he didn't have any. So out of both frustration and pure evil, she grabbed a hammer and beat the life out of William without any remorse. Taylor's grandfather, Denton Stringer, was initially investigated as a potential suspect. However, with no solid evidence connecting him to William's murder or Taylor's involvement, authorities ruled him out. As for Joseph Rogers and Sean, they were both cleared of any involvement in William's death. The two had nothing to do with the crime whatsoever, and were simply scapegoats for Taylor to point fingers at. As for Taylor, she was charged with first-degree murder on October 9th, 2019, and in January 2020, she accepted a plea deal that meant she'd avoid a life sentence. Instead, she was sentenced to over 40 years in prison. Her first chance at parole will come in 2059.